Excellent. Good. We'll go ahead and get started. I see folks coming in. I think we're letting folks in one by one. So we'll give everybody another 30 seconds or so and jump into what I know is going to be a great conversation. And many thanks to the large number of the media who have chosen to join us today. We are at the top of the hour on the East Coast. And we'll go ahead and get started in just about 30 seconds. If you have any issues or technical issues, please use the chat function. Hopefully you came with good questions. You can also use the chat function and start putting those in. For today's format, I'll make some opening remarks and then turn it over to my excellent colleagues. And then we'll open it and hopefully use most of the time for robust Q&A with members of the media. So with that, good afternoon and good morning, because we have a number of our friends on the West Coast. Thank you everyone for joining today's virtual briefing on behalf of Incubate, the early stage investor community, and my distinguished colleagues here. I'm pleased you could join today's event. My name is John Stanford. I'm the executive director of Incubate. It's the national coalition that brings the perspective of life science venture capital to policymakers. Today's press event, which as a reminder is on the record and a recording will be made available and our speakers will be made available for follow-up. Today's event comes at a critical time in the drug pricing debate that has gone on for a number of years. So long that Incubate was actually created because to be the voice for those at the heart of the life science research ecosystem that had been absent at the start of this debate. That certainly changed, but we're still staring at a misguided policy proposal that will dramatically change how investors, who you'll hear from today, will act in the early stage ecosystem. I speak, of course, of the language included in Build Back Mansion, as some of you have dubbed it in the media, or the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. To be clear, Incubate opposes the drug price control mechanism included in the legislation. We've told Congress time and again that this will disrupt the early stage investment that is so critical. Even worse, however, some of the features disincentivize certain types of drugs, completely at odds with scientific discovery. And while there are a number of pro-patient provisions that we have endorsed over the years, including patient smoothing and capping out-of-pocket costs, too few of the dollars coming out of the innovation ecosystem actually help patients afford their medicine. I'm pleased to have leaders from the life science investment community, as well as Dwayne, thanks for joining us, whose Vital Transformation Report is a must-read. We have Peter Kolchinsky, founder and managing partner at RA Capital Management. Jean-Francois Formella, JF, as many of them know him, a partner at Atlas Venture. Gaurav Gupta, founder and managing partner at Ascendant Biocapital, all of whom, I should stress, wear doctor in their title, in that they all come from a deep background of medical experience and expertise. Not to say that Dwayne does not. Dwayne Schultes is the managing director of Vital Transformation, who just wrote a timely report. There continues to be a misunderstanding on the impact of this legislation, and these experts are speaking out. A letter signed by more than 1,000 investors, researchers, patients, and development stage biopharma companies expressed concerns about the reconciliation legislation. Another letter signed by more than 500 biotechnology executives, investors, and academics and patient advocates issued warnings against this leading drug plan and, quote, immediately will halt private funding of drug discovery and development. That's one of many letters, Incubate Policy Lab reports that are all available for those doing additional write-up. We're here to speak with one message. If price controls that are included in this are enacted, it will no longer justify significant investment in R&D. Investment won't just be reduced, it will drop off a cliff. This will trigger a crisis for America's biotechnology companies and the jobs they provide. And so we're also here to talk about what we can do facing the political reality and how we can make sure that any legislation that addresses the life science community can continue to ensure American biopharmaceutical leadership and benefit to patients. So with that, I'd like to welcome today's speakers, and I'll first kick it over to Peter Kolchinsky, who's been vocal. He's one of the lead authors of those letters I mentioned, a scientist by training and a leader in the life science community. Peter, you've been vocal about how this bill would put uncertainty into already risky investments. Can you talk a little bit about that and your view generally on where we stand in the drug pricing debate?
Sure. And thanks, John. I am a scientist by training. I'm an investor, have been an investor for my whole career, a little over 20 years now. I normally just focus on looking for really great new promising molecules of all kinds, biologic small molecules that might solve unmet needs. I don't normally get out there and engage in lobbying, but for the last few years, I've come to appreciate platforms like this for getting out there and trying to make a case for our industry's value proposition, because it's really intimidating seeing what happens when America's anger over affordability of drugs turns into misguided policy that tries to fix that problem, but in kind of the wrong way. John is absolutely right that the bill as written right now, where CMS would be given the power to essentially set the prices with really draconian punishments for any company that doesn't accept the prices they want for drugs, would be harmful to some innovation. So the bill says for biologic drugs, these are larger molecules that tend to get injected, we will set the price down by a minimum of 35%, but really there's no floor, so we have to assume they'll go a lot lower after 13 years on the market. Now, drugs on average enjoy about 14 years of patent-based protection. That's what we've been long used to. So 13 years is a little bit shorter than 14. So I'll be honest, it's not going to be the end of the world for biologic investing. Biologic investing, for diseases of aging will continue. But for small molecule drugs, and this is the crux of the problem, and why many of us here, Gaurav and JF and I and many others have come together to speak out. Small molecules, for some strange reason, though we do now understand the reasons, but when we first saw it, we just thought like, wow, this is weird. They get price controlled after just 9 years, and it's almost as if Congress has it in, for this whole diverse toolkit of drugs that, are actually some of the best ways you could solve any disease. Small molecule drugs are what you see anytime you take a pill. Lipitor, blood pressure medications, those are all small molecule drugs. They have like simple little chemical structures to them. And when their patents expire, they go generic and they become pennies a pill. Now, PBMs might try to extract a fortune with their middleman fees, but as you've seen from Mark Cuban's Cost Plus Pharmacy, it is possible to sell those kinds of generics for super cheap, which is cool, right? Like when we fund the development of these new molecules, we haven't really accomplished our mission until those drugs launch and years later actually go generic and become a public good. That's a remarkable service to society. And we understand that America is really upset that there are some drugs, mostly biologics, that actually fail to go generic. So what's good about this bill is it puts an end to the kind of patent gaming and rent seeking that you get from certain drugs, including insulins, including Humira, that have just failed to become public goods years and years after their initial patents should have expired. So Congress is trying to fix that. This bill does fix that, but then for some weird reason, it also treats small molecules in this unusually harsh way and deters us from being able to invest in small molecule R&D. So I hope that's what we can focus on here. Please don't mistake this as us opposing this bill overall. There's so much good in it. So it can simply be fixed in a score neutral, in a budget neutral way and passed, and patients will benefit, innovation will continue, and there'll be a few adjustments that need to be made. There will be a little bit of R&D that does get curtailed, but all in all, it would be a compromise that would be workable.
And JF, I want to tag you in here for a brief introduction, if you can share your role at Atlas. But can you talk a little bit about the innovation that's outstanding in the small molecule space and why there is clearly a disconnect between this bill and scientific discovery?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, John. So I'm Jean-François Formela, also known as JF. Like Peter, I'm a scientist by background. I was trained in medical intensive care. I spent a couple of years in pharma, and very quickly I went into venture 25 years ago. Most of what I do, in fact, all of what I do day to day is to start new companies. So it's interesting, and I'll echo what Peter was saying. You know, what we typically do is focus on the science and trying to start to find really powerful new science and think about how it can be translated into a medicine. And the very basic principles that we use day in, day out, and that's what we love about our job, is very simple. It's called science first. We're guided by science. And so what I mean by that is that we're going to look at whatever technology, whatever modality is most likely to translate into a medicine, a new medicine for patient. And what's striking in that bill, at least in that provision, is that we can no longer be agnostic and just be guided by science first. We now have to deal with that distortion that, to be honest, we can only anticipate the impact, but we all feel that there will be very material unintended consequences. And what's really bad about it is that the timing, which is what John was alluding to, is actually very bad, because in oncology, for example, there is a renaissance in small molecules, and chemistry has made tremendous progress in the past 2 decades. And all of us are seeing very, very good science, great new targets in oncology that are informed by all the progress that we've made in cancer biology. And now we have all those small molecule chemistry tools to address them and to essentially attack new targets in cancer. But even if we scientifically, and I would say emotionally, we're all doctors, we want to jump in and try to solve one particular target with those modalities. Now our investors and our pharma partners are going to kind of put pressure on us because the value is no longer the same. So the basic premise here is that it just doesn't make sense to introduce such a distortion in the investment model and distract company founders from just going and sticking to that basic principle, science first. So our ask is, don't do that. Just let us be agnostic. Let us use all the tools of science to address diseases. Furthermore, I would say that not only for oncology, but for disease of aging, small molecules are actually the most effective and cheapest ways to treat those diseases. What's very ironic is that now we're going to bias the balance and the incentive of investment toward treatments that are actually more expensive to administer and to manage. So, please avoid the mistake, be rational, and don't introduce a distortion.
Thanks. And a reminder, I know we're starting to already have some questions come in, but please use the Q&A function, and those will come right to me, and I'll get the questions going here shortly. Or you can raise your hand to ask a question live. Gaurav, there are sections of the bill that, as we said at the top, are very pro-patient. Any thoughts on sort of what is the patient's impact from this legislation, and where maybe could it be expanded?
Yeah, thanks, John. So, it's being claimed that this legislation imposes a $2,000 cap on out-of-pocket costs for Medicare Part D beneficiaries while smoothing those costs throughout the calendar year. The reality is the impact from these changes is quite minimal, and we all need to be clear-eyed about exactly how limited they are for most Americans. Stepping back on our side of the table, and for me personally as a physician, we've long believed that out-of-pocket costs present a real barrier to medication access, and reform should focus on eliminating out-of-pocket costs entirely. So from that lens, there's several issues with this legislation. First, the threshold for the cap affects a very small percentage of Medicare Part D enrolled patients. So we know that, for instance, in 2019, a $2,000 threshold would only have applied to 2.6% of the nearly 33 million Medicare Part D beneficiaries. So that's a pretty small group of patients that are going to see a benefit. And how big is that benefit to them really? I mean, the reality is most of those patients also deal with even higher out-of-pocket costs for physician services under Medicare Part B, which is not addressed at all. The Part D cap will not extend to Americans who receive coverage through employers, exchanges, or other health plans. And importantly, the out-of-pocket cap and smoothing provisions don't kick in until 2024, 2025. So those 2.6% of Medicare Part D patients won't see changes at the pharmacy counter directly for several years. So clearly, the vast majority of Americans are not going to see meaningful changes at the pharmacy counter, at least for a couple of years. The small percentage of those who do, it won't happen until 2025. And I think we can all rest assured that the increases in their Part B out-of-pockets will more than cancel it out at that point. So rather than kicking in at a $2,000 threshold, a more logical approach would have been to structure or offer first dollar coverage relief so that the majority of patients can actually see a benefit at the pharmacy counter. I think what's important is, as we step back, is that far from a triumphant victory over out-of-pocket costs, in my estimation, I think in most of ours, this bill doesn't do very much. In fact, it certainly doesn't do nearly enough to help defray out-of-pocket costs. And I think the reason for that is that at its core, it largely ignores the bad behavior of insurance companies, pharmacies, and pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs, who will still all sit between a medication and the patient who needs it. And they're going to continue to utilize a system of discounts and rebates, which drive up list prices and patient out-of-pocket costs, while still obscuring that nearly 50% of prescription drug spending ends up in the pockets of this kind of complex thicket of middlemen. And that ties to another obvious way, at least obvious to me, in which this law seems to have been drafted to protect these very middlemen. It actually repeals the requirement that insurers and PBMs have to pass prescription drug discounts on to patients. So under this legislation, patients will pay cost sharing based on list prices, even if these exceed the actual cost to health plans. The only possible reason to remove this rule, in my opinion, is to allow insurers and PBMs to pocket savings rather than patients directly benefiting at the pharmacy counter in the form of, for instance, first dollar coverage relief. So finally, as currently constituted at 12 Eastern on Wednesday, August 3rd, the legislation currently removes the $35 insulin out-of-pocket cap. This just makes no sense. But that's in keeping with a bill that was likely drafted in part to protect middlemen and at the cost of innovative drug development and ultimately patients.
Thanks, Gaurav. Thank you, one, for that analysis. I don't know that we've seen enough coverage, and hopefully today's conversation will get into the lack of true benefits. And I think it would be foolish to not discuss legislation in a political lens. And I think some hopes of realizing solving drug pricing for the American people really isn't something that's necessarily going to come out of this legislation. And Dwayne, the other big knock that there's been a lot of discussion on, a lot of coverage is, okay, we are going to lose innovation here. Peter's touched on it, JS touched on it, Gaurav's touched on it. You had a report released in the last couple of days about the impact. Could you talk a little bit about that report? And then we already have questions coming in, and we're going to jump right into two questions already with live answers. So Dwayne, can you give us the highlights of the Vital Transformation Report?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, John, Gaurav, Peter, and JF. Pleasure to be here with you. I'm the sole person on the panel who doesn't have a PhD. I'm simply an MBA who I used to work for the Wall Street Journal in product development and market research and computer programming, and then started doing epidemiology work for many governments here and some HTA comparative assessments for new therapeutics. And that's kind of how Vital Transformation got started. We've sort of been dragged kicking and screaming into the pricing debates over HR3 and MFN and several of the bills that have been passed or at least been threatened in the United States. And we've sort of gotten involved in this. We took a different approach. We looked at the 20 most likely drugs to be drawn into this thicket of this pricing mechanism, this Build Back Better negotiation. And I think it's really important to state that these pricing levels that are in the bill, the 40, 60%, based on the amount of time the drug has been in the market, are considered the maximum fair price. So it's highly likely, particularly from what we've seen in Europe, that these prices will end up lower. Europe now is 75% below the average US price if you look at the top 10 drugs over the last 20 years. And this is a political bill, and there's nothing for us to think or make us think that this is not going to occur as well. Our analysis, if we restricted it just to CMS and the CMS market, we were roughly 2 billion, 3 billion off the CMS number. They were at 289 billion. We were at 293 billion by the time you got to 2031. However, because the pricing number that is thrown out, this maximum fair price, this ceiling price, is not confidential, we find it very difficult to believe in a political situation where this bill is that this will not impact commercial markets outside of CMS. We do think that this will have a broader impact. There's no way you can put a price in the market that's 40, 50, 60, 70% lower than the Medicare price and make it public and not have political pressure to drive that down, whether that's be through political action or legislation. We just don't see it. So we did add an extra two-year delay to get the prices down in the commercial market after that lower barrier was set in that ceiling price. So we're seeing 345 billion of market impact by 2031. So roughly, 55 billion more than the CMS estimates by the time we get to 2031. Now, what does this mean? The 12 companies that we analyzed with the 20 therapeutics, they made 588 billion global investments into their pipeline over the last 10 years. 440 billion of those investments were in the United States alone. Now, if you reduce that liquidity in the probability function in a statistical logit function, and you pull that out, you see a huge pressure and added risk. As Peter mentioned, you radically increase the risk of investing, and it really puts a substantial amount of the 110 drugs that these companies had a hand in their pipeline getting to market over the last 10 years. It puts, when you drop by 55% average revenue, and I'd like to point out that 3 of the companies in the 12 we looked at have average drops over 100% of net revenue. So we're talking about zeroing out their average revenue. These are very, very devastating cuts. And again, I don't want to get into the politics of biologics and patent thickets. The reality is you will be cramming down prices, and these will have enormous revenue reductions. If you start dropping those probabilities and increasing the risk, when you drop by 55% revenue, you don't get 55% less drugs. You get 70. 80% less drugs. And that's what we identified based on the statistical probability of market entry. So we're going to see that this has far greater impacts. And one quick point on Gaurav's point about the PBMs. The initial draft of this bill before July included all insulin in the negotiation. There was a really interesting JAMA article published in November out of USC based on SSR's net data for pricing post PBM. And what we find now is it's 35 cents on the dollar that the companies are actually collecting to 40 cents per dollar captured under insulin. So the PBMs now are getting into 60, 70% of the revenue streams in insulin. That was removed from. So anything that could have gone in to try and put a cap or a control on where the PBMs are really gobbling up market share and where you see the highest volumes are also on the highest margins, those have all been pulled out of this bill. It makes us really wonder what the motivations are for this bill practically, because nobody is going to win. It's all going to be a kickback essentially to fund the ACA mandates that are currently unfunded that are going to expire coming into the midterms. We see this as a political trick in many ways, and all these pricings will be the big hits come 5 years down the road when most of the politicians are no longer in office. It's really pernicious and it's really unfortunate. And I'll take questions after that.
I appreciate that, Dwayne, and we'll make sure that all attendees get the Vital Transformations report. Opening it now, already have questions coming in. I'd like to start, JF, you raised, this is a question for Peter, but that small molecule versus biologics. Can the 9-year timeline issue be addressed we know how important budget neutral is, it's Congress. How can it be addressed in a neutral way? Peter, I know you've done some work on this, so I'll kick that to you. And a key question, are lawmakers interested in making this change? And I'll share some thoughts on that, but Peter, over to you.
Sure, thank you. So the way that this bill is scored, there's really an emphasis on just the next 10 years. And, when Gaurav, JF, and I look at this bill, we think about its implications in the 2030s and 2040s, right? So all the drugs, that Congress is trying right now to figure out how to price control, they're drugs that are already on the market. They can't be uninvented, right? So whether you end up setting the prices of 10 or 15 drugs, in the year 2026 or 2027, that changes the math that Congress is focused on, the CBO scores in this decade, and that, all of Congress's attention is on. And what we're basically saying is, okay, but, in an effort to try to save, a few $billion extra by price controlling some small molecule drugs 9 years instead of, 13 years, what you're doing is creating this toxic disincentive for investors to plant the seeds of new small molecule drugs for the clinical studies for drugs that won't launch until, let's say, the year 2030. And if they launched in 2030, ordinarily they would go generic in the year 2044. And this bill will now essentially cut off their profits in the year 2039. This is nothing you've paid attention to, or that you care about, or that you have bothered to really try to understand. This is an inadvertent byproduct of trying to extract a few $1 billion more by targeting some specific drugs like Eliquis, the most expensive line item of small molecule drugs for Medicare today. So, boy, we'd really like to price control Eliquis in 2026 rather than 2027. So what we basically said is, look, how about you shift the treatment of small molecules to be the same as for biologics, give them 13 years. And yes, that means you will give up $6 billion in savings in this 10-year period, because you're delaying the price controls on some drugs by several years. But in exchange, you can make up for it by simply mandating that CMS get a deeper discount. In fact, it would only take a slightly deeper discount in after year 13. So delay when you impose the price control, and then take a deeper discount. Instead of 35%, it just needs to be 42. Right? So that one tweak makes this whole thing completely budget neutral in the 10-year period that Congress and the CBO care about. But it is a night and day difference in terms of how we look at the expected returns of the small molecule projects that we are just embarking on today, and that won't be subject to price controls until the 2040s. Right? So it's a totally doable fix, budget neutral. We don't even expect this is the kind of thing where a senator needs to publicly say, I'm going to vote down this bill unless. It's such a reasonable, modest fix that we're just hoping that one or more senators behind the scenes says, why even make a big deal out of it? They're making a reasonable request and they're not opposed to the bill overall, though I actually do agree with Gaurav. It's sad that we've gotten to this point and we're fixing such a big problem with drugs, where we're going to make sure that drugs never again turn into indefinite rents. We're going to solve the problem of Humira. And what are we getting for patients? A little bit of help, but it would have been good to win something more for patients. So when this bill is passed, the problem of drugs remaining expensive for too long, for Medicare, will be solved for the rest of all time. We will have a lot of work to do to continue to win further improvements for affordability for patients.
Yeah, and I think to tack on to the end of the question is, are lawmakers open? We hope that through coverage today, but also what has been a fairly aggressive effort to raise the issue of 9 versus 13 years. What I think we've removed is, whether it's Senate Finance or now the Senate more broadly, a lack of knowledge on this issue. I think that, and we hope that those of you in the media covering this will raise that this is a very solvable, small change in the bill that makes a meaningful change to the investors you're hearing from today. Otherwise, they're walking away from small molecule to some extent. So I think the ball is now in Congress's court. This is a very clear and simple change to some extent that can undo a unnecessary disincentive in the bill. And JF's point that these small molecule drugs that do have the pathway to simple genericization are the ones that can stand to save society a lot of money. And we know that that's a key driver in spiraling healthcare costs. And so it definitely seems like this particular pocket of drugs will be disincentivized at just the wrong time, particularly as oncology to some extent swings back to looking at small molecule as a product. We'll pivot to another question about talking about first dollar coverage. This is a common question that I'd say we get from the Hill. you talk about that. Can you please address how that would impact insurance premiums? Like, and I think this is a regular question. If you would push one lever, well, surely we're going to see premiums rise, and how that would impact companies with their healthcare costs, and how the government and taxpayers are to cover high drug costs. I would say, and then I'll open it up to the panel, but there's a study that we'll circulate and follow up that showed covering out-of-pocket costs, getting rid of those first dollar costs, did not lead to a meaningful increase in healthcare costs, which in turn would drive the next year's premiums. So there is a small but growing amount of studies that show it's not one or the other. By simply saying someone doesn't have to pay that first $50 or $100, that we're going to see premiums skyrocket. So I think those studies are worth a second look and attention, not just from the media, but from policymakers, because that belief has been hard, that if we close out of pocket costs, we drive up premiums. That's simply not true. And Peter, I'm going to come to you in a second, because I know you have some thoughts on, what using these as cost containment measures. But I also think one of our frustrations as the early stage ecosystem with this legislation is we have a crisis in this country with regards to healthcare costs and healthcare payers. We have a system where if you move from one plan to another plan, the plans feel like they don't realize the savings. And yet something like curing liver disease with products in the 2010s that did that, insurance companies and payers wondered, well, how are we going to realize the savings if someone leaves the plan? And that's a constraint in our society that we have to address when the savings from these drugs get realized, to Peter's point, not in a 10-year budget window, but over 20 years, 30 years, 50 years in the case of some of the innovations that we have. So none of this legislation and none of the policy dialogue in this space has wanted to solve that very complex issue. But we also have studies saying we really don't need these first dollar costs to scare off patients. Peter, anything you want to add on cost containment?
Sure. I would draw everybody's attention to the Q&A, where a few people have posed these questions. And while John was speaking, I wrote out some answers. So you're welcome to quote what's there. And there's a link to, for example, the budget neutral proposal slides that show why it can be made budget neutral. I would point out that there's this unexamined faith in our system that we need to preserve skin in the game, that patients need to have financial skin in the game, or else they will just start joyriding all kinds of treatments that they don't need. That may have been true at some point in the past for certain kinds of drugs, but what are we talking about when we talk about Medicare drugs? We're talking about drugs for retinal degeneration that require injections in your eyeball. Who's going to go saying like, oh, look, there's no out-of-pocket costs for that, I'm going to go get me some? Like, nobody wants these drugs unless they need them, right? So the reason for out-of-pocket costs, would be if it's up to a person to decide whether or not they should see a doctor, right? Or to call an ambulance, having a little bit of money there to nudge the person to think twice. Okay, I understand that. It can still feel heartless sometimes, but I understand the utility of nudging a person to think twice. But when you finally pay that out of pocket to see your doctor, and your doctor diagnoses you with cancer and prescribes chemo, that is horrible, or an immuno-oncology agent, that's no walk in the park either. You don't really need an out-of-pocket cost to make sure that that person only takes it if they need it. They have cancer. It is on label. It's an appropriately prescribed drug, and even their own insurance will review it and prior authorize it. Your own insurance plan agrees that these drugs are right for you. And then they say, okay, now pay list price up to your deductible or pay 20% coinsurance. And if you can't, shucks. That's not, that basically is a repudiation of your promise to people as an insurance plan. Congress shouldn't allow that. And Scott Gottlieb himself at one point called out, like, who's overutilizing or who's, taking chemotherapy recreationally? Like, it doesn't make sense to have out-of-pocket costs for these drugs.
And I'm pivoting to a couple questions that come in around the same theme. JF, I want to start with you, and then Gaurav and Peter as other investors maybe add in. One of the premises is that investment uncertainty will drive down investment. You're a steward of a fund. You take funds and you go deploy them. If your predicted return changes, how does that change your investment thesis? And what will a price control mechanism that's unpredictable mean to your fund in particular?
Yes, so you said the keyword. The keyword is uncertainty, because the irony and the sad part of all that is that it's very difficult for us at the early stage when we start a company based on just basic science and look at that path to go from basic science to drug discovery to drug development. It's incredibly hard to predict with any precision, what the impact is going to be, but knowing that there will be an impact and it can be very material. And when we do our due diligence and we talk to a number of partners and we talk to key opinion leaders about how much money is going to cost to develop that drug. So in oncology, for example, the issue is compounded by the fact that most oncology drugs are developed over many years, which is for regulatory reason and technical and scientific reason, you typically start with an indication where a lot of the other drugs for that particular cancer have failed. And you need to show that your drug can actually be active in that small population. That's a way to ensure the drug is safe and active. And then over the years, you spend more money on more clinical trial to expand your indication and to try to treat more patients with other type of tumors. If the clock is running, you kind of just see that you're going to run out of time to make that investment, because then you don't know. It could very well be that your drug might not be affected, but it might be affected. So there is also another limitation here in that kind of proposed legislation. And I know it's very hard to make everything predictable, but anything that can reduce uncertainty is going to be incredibly helpful. And furthermore, the problem again here is a distortion, the disincentive between small molecule and biologics. It's going to be a natural inclination of many investors, and not just us, but you have to realize it's the people who invest in us. We don't, this is not our money. Our money comes from pension funds, firefighter, school teacher, it comes from university endowments who are investing to essentially support bigger mission. But they have a fiduciary responsibility to whatever institutions they work for. And they don't like uncertainty either. And they count on us to invest where we think we have the best probability of return. And with a provision like that, you just don't know. That's the basic problem. It's introduced a massive uncertainty.
And I want to come to you in a second because I know some of your work has touched on this, but Gaurav, you're a different investor, different thesis, different focus, different fund. Same thoughts, different thoughts?
Well, no, I think JF said it well. It's going to be difficult for any biotechnology company to, frankly, operate in the face of erratic, kind of reimbursement markets, and have CMS, which has long been, had a healthy relationship with the regulator, really become an antagonistic kind of force, picking out specific drugs and specific companies. As we've described, this negotiation is really hardly a negotiation at all. It's really a one-way ratchet to sort of crushing specific drug prices. So I do think it's going to ripple across various kind of facets of the venture capital community without specifically affecting one type of institutional investor or another. I also wanted to add a quick comment to the question around first dollar out-of-pocket cost reduction. And, what's very clear is that there are improved health outcomes generated from pharmaceutical purchasing. There's a lot of scientific and economic literature, and that's why it's so intuitive to me, particularly as a physician, that we should be incentivizing patients and making it easy for them to access their medications. It's not over time going to be cost additive to approach it that way. It's going to actually save costs. And stepping back even further, I think it's really important to contextualize pharmaceutical spending to the other costs in the healthcare system. If we assume that healthcare costs are, a zero-sum game. Premiums are really driven mostly by health expenditure in hospital spending. Branded drugs really only account for about 8% of our healthcare spending today. So changes, and within that, as we've described, a good chunk of it does not go directly to drug companies. It goes to a group of middlemen. So what's fairly clear is that if we can do a better job to eliminate access to barriers to access of medication, and eliminate the first dollar cost to patients, we will actually see better health outcomes, possibly even drive premiums down, but it certainly wouldn't be an added cost over time in the way that I think the question seemed to be posed.
I appreciate that. I think that's a point that needs to come through. Dwayne, I want you to weigh in on all this, but I also want to tie this back to something always on the mind of politicians, and that is jobs, 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 which I think your report also looked at. They're talking about cutting back investment. How does that play out in the other part of the economy?
Yeah, sure. And again, when you're looking at these large revenue reductions, we've done a simple multiplier, which is pretty common, 2.08 across the economy. You pull that out, looking at taxes, and then you look at the impact on jobs. We're seeing, 590,000 jobs lost per annum in 2031, based on an $82 billion reduction, which we model, which again sits pretty close, not too far off, the budget number that came out of CBO. I'd also like to pick up on something JF mentioned. He makes a really important point about the approval pathway that we're seeing for oncology products. Generally you come in under an accelerated approval, often using a surrogate endpoint, looking at a small indication where other drugs have failed. I need to point out that that is also under attack right now. There's been a whole bunch of problems around the accelerated approval. This is also being called into question. Now it's maybe being fixed in PDUFA, but as we saw from what happened with the Alzheimer's treatment and the overruling of CMS over an FDA and the calling for extra evidence, and a lot of what's been happening in Oregon and Tennessee around the Medicaid reforms and the 115 reforms, we're seeing a lot of action and a lot of questioning of the even use of a surrogate endpoint, which is so vital to getting a lot of these oncology products to market. So you're going to get potentially squeezed on two sides regulatorily here. So it's not a simple problem of, do we just focus on, the tail end here at 9 or 13 years? You're also looking at potentially, if this starts to go, a 3-year delay at the median, what it takes to generate the extra evidence, which we see from a cohort of 206 accelerated approvals that we've looked at over the last 20 years. So there's multiple problems here that we need to be really cautious about.
Thanks, Dwayne. I think it is important to look, and we're only focusing on the negotiation provisions, but there's even more in this bill, let alone what's going on with the accelerated approval pathway. A question coming in, to provide some context, some House Democrats opposed H.R. 3. The Senate Democrats, by and large, didn't really move forward in any meaningful way with H.R. 3, largely around concerns of its impact on innovation. How does this bill impact innovation as compared to H.R. 3? Peter, I saw you can't come off mute, so maybe I'll kick it to you first.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it is useful to go back a few steps to see how we got to this bill. So, the first time that many of us really woke up to what Congress had in mind in terms of fixing drug pricing was H.R. 3. And it was pretty shocking and disturbing to see the proposal of drug price controls, also called Medicare negotiation, but applied to really all drugs and even from the moment they launch. And we got together, we wrote a letter explaining the harms. That's our thing. We write letters, write analyses. You should see our internal emails. They're lengthy letters, like this. And we gathered hundreds of signatures from patients, researchers, NIH-funded researchers even came, stood with us and said, yeah, this would be a terrible policy. And we were heartened to see Congress veer off from H.R. 3. Scott Peters put out a much more reasonable bill that said, let's impose Medicare negotiation after the initial patent duration, again, average of about 14 years, so that we can ensure that all drugs go generic without undue delay, and proposed more generous, out-of-pocket cost reductions for patients. That would have been a great bill. But that bill ended up going through a process of extreme compromise, shall we say, to create what became known as the drug provisions of Build Back Better, BBB. So when that came out at the end of last year, with 9 versus 13 treatment of small molecules and biologics, the exact problem we're talking about now, we wrote a letter explaining the harms, exactly like we've written a letter explaining the harms now. We wrote a letter back in December. So if you go on the nopatientleftbehind.org website, you will see that letter that we wrote that hundreds of people signed, again, patients, researchers, small company executives, investors, saying this would be harmful. Now, BBB ended up, being killed for other reasons. We don't presume that somebody listened to us back then and said, oh yes, this would be a real problem, we shouldn't pass BBB. It was killed for other reasons. But when Congress then came back, when we started seeing new legislation form, they were copying and pasting from other bills in the past to create the current Senate bill, and they just copied and pasted the drug provisions of BBB, leaving the 9 versus 13 in place, and basically said, well, it's really essential that we get this bill passed. We want to do it before August recess. We need the votes, and we're all behind it. And we're like, oh boy, we'd better get the word out again. So we wrote another letter, really reiterating the stuff we'd written back in December, but this time trying to be like more eloquent, use more analogies, got more people involved. This latest letter has over 1,200 signatures, more than we've ever gotten before. We don't know how else to be heard, and we're trying to say, like, please pay attention to this one provision. You don't really mean this. You can't really mean this. It makes no sense for anybody, and you can fix it and it would be budget neutral. And it's kind of like the movie Don't Look Up, where you kind of wonder, like, why won't people just look at something so obvious? And what we've discovered is that there's a lot of people that really, like, they have to cover so many issues in Congress. Staffers have to cover so much. They're not, skilled in the exact kinds of things that are required to understand the impact of this. Net present value calculations and investment calculus, that's not what they trained for. And there's a sense that, well, this has already gone through so much debate and compromise. Surely if it's as bad as you say, it wouldn't have gotten this far. And so it's almost like the more extreme and outlandish and absurd a mistake is, the more likely it will go unchallenged by anybody, because they assume that someone else would have already fixed it by now. And what we're saying is, this was never thoroughly examined. It was a partial byproduct of HR 3 being shot down and some attempt to cobble together Build Back Better, which was ultimately abandoned because Build Back Better got killed, right? And so now, don't just cut and paste it from an old bill as if that was settled. It wasn't settled. Pick it up, re-examine it, and fix it, right? It's doable. So we can only hope that in the remaining few days, if that's really all we have left before August recess, that someone or a few senators, but behind the scenes say, why don't we just make this fix? It seems quite reasonable. There's every reason to do it. There's no reason not to do it, and we can still pass this.
A fairly direct plea. Gaurav, any thoughts?
Well, I just think as a sector, as an industry, we are exquisitely regulated, both at the level of at the FDA initially, but then once our drugs are on market now it's CMS. And I think we've seen over the last year that relationship has grown more complex, less predictable. We're now facing, a more erratic regulatory environment with multiple FDA chiefs. And I think some of the problems at FDA have also come to the fore. I think that in general, there are many ways in which the regulatory apparatus that we work through and work with and have successfully partnered with over the last decade, and we've really seen a golden age of innovation. It seems like those wheels are starting to turn almost against the sector here, in a way that is not only counterproductive, but is baffling to most of us, coming off of the success of some of the pandemic vaccines, therapies, and including small molecule drugs that obviously wouldn't be needed after 9 years. But it seems that we do need some louder allies in Washington writ large to understand more deeply the ways in which these small changes, small policy changes, what may strike some as a kind of interagency turf battle between CMS and FDA, can really dramatically impact innovation and can wipe out the potential for cures of diseases like Alzheimer's, like certain types of cancer, like diseases of aging, such as cardiac conditions. The stakes are extraordinarily high for what may seem like dry policy to some.
We are closing out at the top of the hour, so I'll make a last call for any last minute questions, but have one here. The bill, in some variety, I'm going to change the number, but hundreds of billions of dollars coming out of this industry, where early stage companies are typically acquired by large manufacturers. Whether it's the pharmaceutical industry or any other industry, what impact from the M&A perspective would you envision having $300 billion less in the system is going to have on your ability to raise capital and move companies forward? So
the pharmaceutical industry right now, has been going through its own separate, crisis to do with the macro economy and interest rates. Biotech has been significantly beaten down. It's tough for small companies these days. Pharma has a fair bit of cash on its balance sheets. And if pharma were to see that ultimately all of its drugs, at least for diseases of aging, will have to, ultimately go off of a patent cliff or a Medicare negotiation cliff, one way or the other, those profits will end, then we believe that ultimately pharma will be all the more motivated to find more new medicines that they should help develop and launch. That's what society needs our industry to do, to focus on how we can earn a reward for making new and better medicines. It is not in society's interest to reward old medicines, right? So the harms of this bill, if unchanged, would be that, it will, put an end to a lot of pharma's revenues for older drugs, but it will eliminate the incentive for pharmas to work with small companies or acquire small companies that are developing small molecule drugs for diseases of aging, because ultimately there won't be enough profit for anybody, not the small company, not the pharma, to bother taking on all that risk and cost for just 9 years on the market. So change it to 13 and you get a virtuous cycle, but leave it at 9 and you just break the system.
Well, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank this impressive group of people, 3 folks who spend their days investing capital in the earliest stages of life science. Dwayne, your research at Vital Transformation has been outstanding. All of these resources are available on Incubate's website, incubatecoalition.org. We'll send to everyone from the media a wrap up of today's event with all the details. I think our various panelists put it well, that the pipeline, the disincentives here are an enormous threat, something Incubate's been saying for a long time. And we are hopeful that today's conversation can lead to some coverage of these under-discussed issues by the media and capture that attention with policymakers, because to all of your points, some of this needs to be fixed and needs to be fixed right away if we want to maintain our biopharmaceutical leadership. So with that, I will close out today's event. Thanks everyone from the media for joining, for my incredible panelists, and have a great rest of your week. Thanks.
Thank you.